Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, an arcade boxing title developed and published by Nintendo for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1987. We're going to get to that title in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 87. I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including an exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewald, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, and Wendell Jr. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show, whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis. I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo review kind of section. And I say pseudo review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, you should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. By all means, go for it. But I cannot recommend these games to the broad game-playing population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Is an arcade boxing title developed and published by Nintendo for the Nintendo Entertainment System back in 1987. Before we can talk about Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! For the NES, we need to go back further into history to talk about the creation of the original Punch-Out! For the arcades. And to do that, we need to begin by talking about that game's eventual creator, Genyo Takeda. Takeda might be a name that is more unfamiliar to many than some of Nintendo's more prominent designers and technologists, like Gunpei Yokoi and Shigeru Miyamoto, both of whom we've talked about several times before. But the fact is that Takeda's contributions to both Nintendo and the video game industry at large are just as significant as both Yokoi's and Miyamoto's. And over the course of his career, not only would he be responsible for countless enhancements to Nintendo's early arcade hardware, but he would also be the man behind the creation of the battery backup save system first used in the original Legend of Zelda, as well as the analog stick for the Nintendo 64 controller, and would even later become one of the lead designers for the Nintendo Wii console, acting as a vocal opponent to simply adding better graphics and horsepower to machines, suggesting rather that gameplay and design will trump sheer processing power any day of the week. Back in 1971, though, Takeda's entire career was still in front of him, as he had just graduated from Shizuoka Government University and was, as most college graduates typically are, in search of a job. As luck would have it, he noticed a job listing in a newspaper advertising roles with Nintendo, who at the time were just beginning to think about pivoting to more of an arcade and gaming focus after spending the majority of their life as a playing card and toy manufacturer. Takeda, having gone to school to learn more about semiconductors and other electrical engineering concepts, thought that this might be a good fit for his skills, so he applied for the job and, after an interview with Nintendo's resident genius engineer Gunpei Yokoi, received a job offer. Takeda didn't waste any time. He accepted that offer and in 1971 would be hired into Nintendo by Yokoi as the newest member of its internal research and development 2 team, or R&D 2 as it was commonly called. Once hired into the company, Takeda would have the opportunity to work on Nintendo's very earliest arcade titles, including mechanical shooting range games like Laser Clay Shooting System and Wild Gunman in 1973 and 1974 respectively, and, perhaps most notably, would be responsible for designing the game that Nintendo calls their first ever true arcade title, EVR Race. EVR Race was an electromechanical horse racing title where up to 6 different players were allowed to bet on races in the hopes of choosing the horse who would ultimately win a given race. Unlike other electromechanical titles, though, EVR Race would include a monitor to display video played from an embedded videocassette, the first time Nintendo would branch out beyond a purely electromechanical device into something that included more digital components. Because Takeda was the designer behind EVR Race, which Nintendo considers their first video game, Takeda himself has been named by many across the company, Shigeru Miyamoto included, as Nintendo's first game designer, despite the fact that his background is actually in electrical engineering. It turns out, Takeda was simply a multi-talented kind of guy. Anyway, after the release of EVR Race, Nintendo would continue to make a variety of games for arcades around the world, with Yokoi, Takeda, and eventually Miyamoto all working in various capacities on those early Nintendo games and the hardware that ran them. Not every endeavor was a full-fledged success, however, as one title in particular would create a situation that could have had disastrous financial implications for the company. That game was Radar Scope, a space fighter game that was effectively a more advanced take on Space Invaders, where players would be tasked with defending a space station from a never-ending onslaught of enemy spacecraft. Radar Scope was released in Japan in 1980, and based on early tests in Seattle, there was belief that the game could potentially become a big hit in the United States. So, the recently created Nintendo subsidiary Nintendo of America, under the leadership of Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi's son-in-law, Minoru Arakawa, decided to take a gamble. Arakawa spent the majority of Nintendo of America's budget on purchasing 3,000 Radar Scope machines, with the hopes that they'd be able to take the United States by storm, turn a tidy profit, and set Nintendo of America up as a true force in the American gaming market. There was only one issue. Because of the shipping logistics that had been in place around this time, the arcade machines had to be transported from Japan to New York, and unplanned shipping delays made it so that the machines didn't reach America until 4 months after they were originally ordered. By that time, any degree of interest in the title had waned significantly, so out of those 3,000 Radar Scope cabinets, only 1,000 made their way into arcades across the United States. This left a significant amount of unsold inventory just sitting in warehouses, which meant that the investment that Nintendo of America made in those machines was effectively a loss. So, Arakawa went to his father-in-law, Hiroshi Yamauchi, and asked if the company could somehow create a game that could be retrofitted into the unsold radar scope cabinets, effectively allowing Nintendo to sell a brand new game using the pre-existing hardware that would otherwise simply sit collecting dust. In an effort to avoid financial ruin, Yamauchi put out a company-wide call for ideas to convert radar scope into something that could potentially make the company some money. While many individuals would attempt to answer that call to action, it was one man, Shigeru Miyamoto, who would end up conceptualizing a winning idea that would, over a period of several months, morph into one of the most influential and successful video games of all time, the arcade classic Donkey Kong. After Miyamoto and others worked to create Donkey Kong conversion kits for the previously mentioned unsold radar scope cabinets, the game was released to the market and became an instant sensation, driving arcade owners everywhere to contact Nintendo for more cabinets to meet the demand of players. Over the course of the next year, more than 60,000 additional cabinets would be sold, and between cabinet sales and gamers spending hard-earned quarters on the machine, Donkey Kong would gross over $280 million by the end of 1982, which is the equivalent of nearly $1 billion in today's economy, an absolutely insane sales figure. Now here's where the story gets more interesting though, because typically when we think about mega successful arcade machines, we think about those machines in terms of their integrated cabinet as opposed to the individual pieces that make up the machine. Or at least, at a minimum, that's how I think about classic arcade machines. But, as is fairly obvious, those cabinets are made up of a number of different components, such as the chips and circuitry that enable the game to run, display graphics, and accept user inputs, and the monitor that allows users to actually see what is happening in a game. It stands to reason that for any company attempting to sell arcade cabinets, they'd have to invest in a ton of the individual components that those cabinets required, which is why Nintendo made significant purchases to bulk buy arcade monitors, since they weren't sure exactly how many machines they would need to manufacture. They only knew that the demand was ever increasing. Well, even the most popular games eventually reach a point of saturation, and Donkey Kong was no exception. After it took the gaming world by storm in 1982, sales for new Donkey Kong cabinets began to slow down, eventually leading to a different kind of issue for Nintendo. They now had a warehouse full of arcade monitors that were sitting unused, effectively creating a similar situation as Nintendo of America's radar scope issue from a couple years prior. Nintendo wanted to figure out how to use all of that unsold inventory, and began brainstorming some ideas about other titles that could potentially use up some of that arcade monitor overstock. There was only one problem. Nintendo had a lot of excess arcade monitors, and by a lot, I mean like a lot. So much so that they didn't believe a traditional single monitor arcade game could even put a dent in their inventory, even if that arcade title became an industry-wide success. So, they began to think about how they could potentially create a non-traditional arcade title, something that would use two monitors instead of just a single screen, which would, by extension, burn through the excess monitor inventory at double the rate as a traditional arcade cabinet. This sounded appealing, though in order to not simply use a bunch of monitors as a throwaway effort, there would have to be a strong game concept to go along with that innovative arcade design. Initial ideas revolved around creating a massive racing game where two screens could be situated side by side to produce an immersive, engaging experience for players, and there was a lot of internal belief that this concept could potentially be a big seller. There was only one issue with that though, and that issue was centered squarely on consumer expectations for new arcade titles coming out in the early to mid-80s. One of the big innovations in arcade gaming around this time was the introduction of Laserdisc technology into a number of arcade cabinets, where titles like Dragon's Lair could recreate visuals that, up to this point, would have been unheard of given the limited hardware present in normal arcade machines. These graphically enhanced titles, while impressive to look at, were effectively an illusion, as most of them were simply streaming pre-drawn or recorded visuals from a Laserdisc as opposed to generating those visuals in real time. Laserdisc titles looked amazing, but it's not as though there was a dramatic leap in hardware power that accompanied their introduction. It was still the same base hardware, just a new way of delivering visual content. It was also a new way for arcade machines to break down, as Laserdisc players weren't designed for continuous and random scene switching. Sure, the underlying technology supported jumping from scene to scene without issue, and in normal use when watching a film, Laserdisc players performed perfectly fine. But when you subject a Laserdisc player to the stress of constant scene jumps as you would experience in a popular arcade game, mechanical issues quickly arose, and repairs to those machines would over time become pretty costly. The issue, though, is that despite those mechanical failures and illusion of more powerful graphics hardware, Pandora's box had effectively been opened, and now arcade gamers had expectations for what they wanted new titles to look like. For companies attempting to keep up with those expectations, they had two choices: either adopt Laserdisc technology themselves, or somehow increase the power of their hardware to create similar high-quality, large, detailed imagery without the added maintenance expense of Laserdisc players. Nintendo recalled how expensive and time-consuming repairs on their prior mechanical arcade machines, like EVR racing, were, and they weren't too keen to jump on the Laserdisc bandwagon. They wanted to avoid those kinds of mechanical issues, but also wanted to meet the demands of the market, which meant they would need to figure out a different way of creating Laserdisc-like graphics, albeit without the use of a Laserdisc player. Interestingly, Nintendo hardware designers had recently come up with a new series of chips that could create some fairly advanced, for the time, visuals, and while Gunpei Yokoi, Genyo Takeda, and Shigeru Miyamoto were trying to figure out how to bring their dual racing screen concept to life, they considered that these new chips might be able to provide the kind of advanced visuals that would allow the game to compete with the Laserdisc-driven graphics of competing titles. Everyone thought this idea had merit, but once they started digging into the technology, they encountered a fairly significant limitation. Nintendo's new chips were capable of advanced sprite scaling, and they were capable of automatically rotating sprites based on programmer instructions, both of which were dramatic improvements over the traditional way arcade games were designed, all of which required manual by-hand manipulation of pixels and graphics. The thing is, while the chip could scale and rotate graphics, they couldn't scale and rotate graphics at the same time. This, as you might imagine, restricted the use of those chips to only a single graphical operation, and this kind of limitation simply would not work for the racing title the team was trying to bring to life. They needed both rotation and scaling in order to make the title they wanted to make, and even beyond that, they wanted to scale multiple images at the same time, which given current hardware of the time, just wasn't possible. So the team went back to the drawing board, and here Takeda had an idea. What if they used these new chips to scale the image of a person as opposed to a bunch of vehicles? By keeping the focus on a singular character, they could avoid rotating any sprites, which allowed them to use the new graphics chipset to focus solely on scaling, which would fit perfectly within the constraints of the hardware. The rest of the team agreed that this idea made sense. Now, they just had to figure out what kind of game to create with that style of character scaling in place. Now, it's not clear exactly who came up with the idea of creating a boxing game out of this concept, but that is ultimately what happened, which is what resulted in the creation of the first Punch-Out arcade machine in 1984. Some of you might be curious about why two screens would be needed for a boxing title, because the fact is, there really is no need to use two screens for a single-player boxing game. Sure, if the game were multiplayer, you could have potentially used a single monitor per player, but Punch-Out was never intended to be multiplayer. It was designed to be a single-player experience. For a period of time, using two screens for Punch-Out seemed like an idea that simply didn't make sense. Takeda, however, would end up having another idea that would end up working perfectly. Thinking about a typical real-world boxing match, you have both the one-on-one match, which is obviously the focus, and oftentimes you have the bright lights, video screens, and expansive stadium-style backdrop that big-time boxing matches often take place in. Takeda considered that by stacking the two screens vertically, he could potentially use the bottom screen in a traditional arcade cabinet orientation, using it for the main boxing match that players would be participating in. The second, higher stacked screen could then be used to recreate the same big stadium kind of feel as a world-class boxing match, including high-quality character portraits and stats that apply to each of the fighters. The team wasn't entirely convinced this would work, but after playing around with an initial prototype, they realized that this dual-screen configuration was pretty darn fun, and it didn't take long before everyone agreed that this concept, and by extension Punch-Out, would be the solution to their excess monitor stock inventory issues. The The team finalized the artwork, much of which was created by Miyamoto himself, added in some music, in what would be legendary composer Koji Kondo's first assignment as a new Nintendo employee, and created a simple control scheme utilizing jabs, hooks, and uppercuts that would, hopefully, attract players to test their skills against the 6 virtual computer-controlled combatants that stood in between players and the in-game World Boxing Championship. Punch-Out would be released to arcades in early 1984, and to say it was a big deal would be an understatement. Over the course of the year, Punch-Out would end up dominating arcades around the world, becoming one of the top-selling arcade titles of the year, and in the United States, taking the crown as the highest-grossing arcade game of 1984. Because of the knockout success of Punch-Out, a sequel would be greenlit before the year even ended, and just 6 months after the original game's release, Super Punch-Out would make its way to arcades in late 1984. This title, more so than the original game, would be helmed almost exclusively by Takeda, as Miyamoto, who had contributed a ton of character artwork to Punch-Out, was rapidly becoming more involved with Famicom game development, and therefore didn't have time to dedicate as much effort to Super Punch-Out's development. Regardless, Super Punch-Out, which would effectively be designed identically to Punch-Out, other than being harder and featuring different characters who utilized some very non-boxing kinds of attacks, would release to critical acclaim, and would end up being awarded the title of Best Game of the Show at the October 1984 Amusement and Music Operators Association, or AMOA, industry event. Following Punch-Out and Super Punch-Out's success, the majority of the design team would go off to work on other endeavors, with Takeda focusing more on hardware, and Miyamoto, like we mentioned, turning his attention to creating revolutionary Famicom games and franchises that would make Nintendo a household name in just a couple of years. As the Famicom continued to gain popularity, and once the Nintendo Entertainment System was released in America to staggering popularity, the creative team at Nintendo began thinking about what types of games to create that could potentially appeal to a broad audience. And here, there was recognition that Punch-Out might be a perfect fit for Nintendo's 8-bit console ecosystem. Wanting to maintain continuity between the original game's development and the potential 8-bit version, Genyo Takeda was assigned to be the director of the title. And with that, work began on creating a version of Punch-Out that would, hopefully, recreate the arcade action of the original, albeit in the comfort of players' homes around the world. Interestingly, because of the difference in technical capabilities between arcade machines and the Nintendo Famicom, the game itself would need to change fairly dramatically. For one, each character model needed to be redefined, as the huge sprites used in the arcade machine required several workarounds to be implemented within the limitations of 8-bit hardware. And secondly, there was the issue of how to create the character that players would control as they were attempting to become the boxing champion of the world. I didn't mention it before, but in the arcade version of Punch-Out, the player character is defined as a green wireframe model, the thought being that you could effectively see through your character to see your opponent and react to their moves. When the time came to implement those graphics and transparency effects for the home market, it was quickly realized that the Nintendo Famicom just was not powerful enough to recreate the same graphical tricks as the arcade version. So, Takeda and the team did the next best thing. They decided to shrink your persona, making a much smaller character who would take up less screen real estate and, therefore, would provide a larger view of your opponent's moves. Because of the diminutive stature of this new character, it only made sense that his name should mirror his size, and with that design decision finalized, the boxer known as Little Mac was born. Various other changes would be made to the home port of the title, with the inclusion of additional fighters and patterns to learn in order to prolong the length of the gameplay experience, as well as a reduction to the overall graphical fidelity to better align with the Nintendo Famicom's hardware capabilities. And, after making those modifications, Punch-Out's development would be complete, though, interestingly, it was not yet slated for a broad public release, despite being 100% ready to ship. The reason for that delay is that Nintendo was in the midst of sponsoring a tournament in their latest golf title, Famicom Golf US Course, and the company thought that it would be worthwhile to make their brand new title, Punch-Out, be an award for individuals attaining high scores during that tournament. To commemorate that accomplishment, 10,000 gold cartridge copies of Punch-Out would be produced, with half given to high scorers in the tournament, while the other half would be distributed via lottery amongst a broader population of Japanese gamers. While that tournament was going on in Japan, a different kind of competition was occurring in the United States, that being the coronation of a young 21-year-old boxer as one of the most fierce, dynamic, powerful fighters the sport of boxing had ever seen. That boxer, of course, was Mike Tyson. Minoru Arakawa, the original founder of Nintendo of America, had an opportunity to attend a boxing match featuring Mike Tyson and was immediately impressed by the fighter's raw power and skill. Arakawa considered that this might be an excellent opportunity to garner some additional attention on their forthcoming Punch-Out release in North America, as Mike Tyson was pretty much one of the most recognizable and bankable boxing stars in the world at this point, and in the United States in particular, anything involving Tyson would immediately draw blockbuster viewership. So, Arakawa approached Tyson with an opportunity, asking if he would be interested in licensing his likeness as a character for Nintendo's forthcoming boxing title, becoming the game's final boss fight. In return, Nintendo would pay Tyson $50,000 for a 3-year exclusivity deal to use his likeness in the game. For a fighter who had not yet won a boxing championship, $50,000 in mid-80s money for nothing other than appearing in a video game sounded like a great deal. So Tyson agreed with the proposal, and with that agreement, Punch-Out would be marketed in the United States as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, with a re-release under the Mike Tyson licensing deal following it in Japan. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would officially release on the market in late 1987, which conveniently for Nintendo was after Mike Tyson ended up winning his first boxing title, which, as you might expect, immediately increased the visibility and demand for the game. Tyson was the hottest fighter in the world, and because of the deal Arakawa had struck a year earlier, Nintendo was now the owner of the official boxing title featuring the hottest fighter in the world. This, as you might have guessed, increased sales of the title well beyond initial expectations, as Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would end up selling over 2 million copies in just a single year following its release, which made it just the second NES game to reach that number of sales in that time period, with the only other game reaching those sales figures being the original Legend of Zelda. Definitely good company for the newly released game to be in. Upon its release, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would receive universal acclaim, with critics and players alike praising the game's graphics, controls, and addicting gameplay loop. It wouldn't take long before Mike Tyson's Punch-Out would make its way to a number of best games of the year lists, followed by being named one of the best NES games of all time, and finally, achieving a position of prominence as one of the best games ever created, period. Countless gamers would end up playing the title in either its original incarnation or, after Tyson's 3-year licensing deal ended, the re-released 1990 variant that replaced Mike Tyson with Mr. Dream, a fictional character with different visuals but the same exact moveset as Iron Mike. Punch-Out as a series would continue to feature releases throughout the next 20 years, with Super Punch-Out coming out for the 16-bit Super Nintendo home console in 1994, and a modernized reboot of Punch-Out for the Nintendo Wii and Wii U releasing in 2009. Various versions of the NES and arcade titles would be re-released on virtual storefronts in modern times, including on the Nintendo Switch, where players young and old can once again attempt to win a championship, using only their fists and their wits to overcome their opponents. The primary individuals who worked on Punch-Out over the years would themselves go on to have quite the careers in the video game industry, with both Miyamoto and Takeda achieving executive positions in Nintendo, Miyamoto becoming the chief creative fellow for the entire company, while Takeda would similarly become a technical fellow within Nintendo, representing his contributions to the video game industry and Nintendo hardware in particular. He would further be recognized at the 21st Annual DICE Awards in 2018 as a Lifetime Achievement Award recipient, which is the video game equivalent of an Academy Awards Lifetime Achievement recognition. It is, to put it mildly, a significant recognition of a career in which Takeda spent relentlessly innovating and pushing the boundaries of what others thought might be possible. With Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, Nintendo and Genyo Takeda were able to take a proven arcade boxing formula, add a dash of celebrity, and in turn, create a game that would resonate with players around the world. As one of the most popular and critically acclaimed titles on the NES, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out undeniably deserves its spot on many gamers' best games of all time lists, and as such, is definitely a title that will undoubtedly be remembered forever. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Mike Tyson's Punch-Out today versus when it was released all the way back in 1987, over 35 years ago. So Punch-Out, as the name implies, is an arcade boxing title, meaning you're going to be taking part in a number of different one-on-one boxing matches where your goal is to figure out and outwit your opponent in the hopes of securing a victory. Despite being an arcade-style title where realism isn't really much of a factor, or at least certainly not the focus, Punch-Out does a decent job of replicating the rules of the sport of boxing. Each fight consists of 3 3-minute rounds with the timer accelerated to speed up gameplay, meaning each round is represented as 3 minutes in the game, but doesn't really take 3 minutes of real time. I didn't personally time it, but I'd say each round moves at around double speed-ish from a timer perspective, which does keep the pace of the game very quick. Your goal, as with traditional boxing, is to secure a victory, which can be accomplished in one of several ways. You may score a pure knockout, which means your opponent was knocked down and unable to get back up before the referee, who by the way is Nintendo's own Mario, can count to 10. Or you may score a technical knockout, or TKO, which happens if you knock your opponent down 3 times in the same round, regardless of if they can answer the referee's count. And finally, you can win via judge's decision, which happens if both you and your opponent are still standing at the end of the 3-round fight. As with real life though, you really don't want your fight going to the judges' scorecards. It's always best to secure a victory with some sort of decisive finality. Now, actually securing that victory involves learning the moves at your disposal and using them effectively. In Punch-Out, you have a fairly simple set of moves you can use. You have control of both your left and right hands, controlled via your B and A buttons respectively, meaning pressing your B button executes a punch with your left hand, and pressing your A button executes a punch with your right hand. By default, if you only press the button but no direction on your control pad, you'll throw a punch to the body. This can be turned into a headshot by pressing up on your control pad along with either the A or a B button, and you'll find that mixing up your attacks is essential because each of your opponents has his own strengths and weaknesses. When attacking your opponent, you might land an especially well-timed hit, which will result in you gaining a star. Now, stars allow you to throw an ultra-powerful uppercut by pressing the start button, and you can store up to 3 stars at a time. But every time you get hit, you lose a star, so there's a pretty careful balance between using your uppercuts as soon as you have a chance and holding on to them for bigger openings that might result in even more damage to your opponent. And speaking of damage, both you and the individual you're fighting have a life bar, which once depleted results in a knockdown. Depending on how many times you've been knocked down in a given fight, you'll either have an easy time of returning to your feet, or you may simply remain knocked down and lose the fight. Recovering from a knockdown involves mashing the A and B buttons as fast as you can, and assuming you do return to your feet before the ref counts to 10, you'll regain a portion of your life bar to use in the remainder of the fight. You can also regain some hit points in a couple of additional ways. For one, as you pepper your opponents with unanswered punches, you may notice your life bar begin to increase as your opponent's decreases. The way I think about this mechanic is almost like a pseudo-momentum meter. As you gain momentum, you gain confidence and a burst of energy, while at the same time causing your opponent to become run down. The same applies if you're on the receiving end of a particularly nasty volley of hits, which would then benefit the computer-controlled character to your detriment. Luckily, though, you don't have to simply stand there and take the hits, as you can dodge left and right by pressing the corresponding direction on the control pad, or you can block shots by holding the down direction. You can't block indefinitely, though, as you also have a stamina meter of sorts, represented by a number of hearts, with a different number allocated to each fight. Every block you execute successfully will deplete 1 heart, while also taking a small portion of your hit points, while getting hit directly without blocking will take several hearts from your stamina meter. If you do end up losing all of your hearts, you'll enter into a tired state where your boxer flashes and you can't perform any attacks until you recover, which will require dodging any incoming attacks. If you're fairly early in the game, you should be able to recover fairly easily, but in the later fights, you could really be in for a world of hurt. Now, assuming you do make it to the end of a round, you'll receive a bit of a breather, where you'll be able to sit in your corner and survey the damage done to you, as well as the damage you've done to your opponent. Each opponent has different stages of damage, which are all shown on their face, and likewise you can gauge how much damage you've taken by taking a look at how pretty, or ugly, your face appears. Both eyes open and a slight smile, you're probably doing okay. One eye shut and half of your face looks like it melted, you've probably taken a beating. During those in-between round moments, you'll also receive some pointers from your manager/coach, as well as hear some pretty cutting insults from your opponent. Okay, that last part is maybe a little bit of a fib, as the insults your opponents sling at you are the kind of thing that you'd probably hear on an elementary school playground. But honestly, I kinda love their innocence. It's really not all that insulting. It really is kind of like those schoolyard barbs, which I really do love. Now, you also have the opportunity in between rounds to recover some hit points, though that can only happen once in any given fight. If you want to recover some life, you have to rapidly press the select button on your controller, but from what I experienced, this entire mechanic feels a little bit hit or miss. Sometimes you can be hammering away at lightning speed only to recover a small sliver of life, while other times a gentle rhythmic series of presses will recover nearly an entire life bar. I am sure there's some trick here that I'm missing, and I do appreciate being able to recover even a little bit of hit points, but there were a couple fights where I ended up losing because the hit point recovery I expected to receive never materialized. Not a huge deal, but definitely inconsistent from my perspective, and if anybody knows what I was doing wrong, please let me know. More consistent though, for the most part, is the individual fighter mechanics that accompany each and every one of your opponents, because, at its core, Punch-Out is a pattern recognition game disguised as a boxing title. Unlike future more advanced games like Electronic Arts' Fight Night series of titles, or even more arcade-centric fare like Ready to Rumble Boxing, Punch-Out doesn't have a ton of artificial intelligence at play. Every single fighter has a set of moves they'll execute in certain situations, with victory only possible if you can observe and learn the patterns in each fighter's style. This might sound like it'd be boring, but in practice, it is anything but, as the fights you experience all feel dynamic and exciting, despite the fact that at the end of the day, you're simply responding to patterns and executing moves to counter your opponent's style. In many ways, Punch-Out's fighters are similar to boss fights in Dark Souls, where each fight is effectively a puzzle to figure out. The first time you enter a battle, you likely know next to nothing, which means you have to feel out your opponent to discover how best to proceed. Once you figure it out though, many of your fights will have you enter autopilot mode, where your muscle memory takes over and you simply respond to each pattern without thinking. This is definitely something that happens when playing any Dark Souls-like experience, and it is also something that I noticed happening as I was making my way through Punch-Out. Unlike Dark Souls though, Punch-Out has a much more gradual difficulty curve, where the early fights you encounter are almost laughably easy, and the later fights you experience are almost maddeningly difficult. The game is structured as a series of weight class-like divisions, each of which have a certain number of fights to complete before you can fight for the championship. Assuming you win the championship, you'll get a password to resume your championship quest from that point, and we'll move on to the next division, where you'll fight a fresh roster of fighters, or in some instances, more difficult versions of fighters you've already faced before. The game is structured around these three divisions, and if you manage to conquer them all, you get to participate in a true dream fight. You get the dubious honor of fighting the one, the only, Mike Tyson. Before we get to Mike Tyson though, I feel like we should talk about some of the other fighters in the game, because I really do have some opinions. Some I loved, some I hated, some don't even warrant a mention, but at the end of the day, they all come together to create a memorable, meaningful gameplay experience. And something I really enjoyed was the fact that early fights and the mechanics used in those encounters are effectively tutorials for similar mechanics you'll face in later fights. This is why, despite its high top-end difficulty, I truly believe Punch-Out has one of the smoothest difficulty curves in this style of game. I felt like the game's designers wanted to teach you along the way, and while I don't think they necessarily wanted you to beat the final fight of the game, because seriously, it's pretty darn brutal, I do think they wanted you to have a degree of success. Anyway, let's talk about some of the fighters, because like I said, I have some thoughts. First up, I need to mention Glass Joe, who is the first fighter you face. Now look, I get it. You need a fight that is effectively the most basic tutorial possible, where it's next to impossible to lose. But even so, Glass Joe is really easy. It's not to the game's detriment, as I can't imagine many people will lose in the first division all that much, which means you likely won't have to fight Glass Joe all that often. but for anyone with even a minor amount of gaming aptitude, Glass Joe is simply a speed bump on the way to better fights, though he has become a bit of a staple in the Punch-Out series. I don't hate the character. I just wish he was slightly more challenging, because you will literally never face someone with as few mechanics and patterns for the entire rest of the game. Piston Honda, who you'll fight twice, once at the end of the easiest division, the minor circuit, and once at the beginning of the hardest division, the world circuit, is what I consider to be a good learning encounter, as he has enough patterns that you really do have to pay attention, and if you mess up, you are in for a world of hurt. He's certainly not one of the more challenging fighters in the game, but he is the first fighter you face where you'll kind of go, okay, I actually have to focus now. His second incarnation is a bit trickier than the first, with additional moves to watch out for, but by the time you face him the second time, you'll likely be skilled enough that he won't end up posing too much difficulty. And actually, I should probably mention that most fighters in the game, beyond having a set of mechanics and patterns to learn, will usually telegraph their moves by some sort of tell, which if you can learn them, will let you more effectively counter the move, sometimes in advance of getting hit. For Piston Honda, as an example, he'll occasionally execute a series of fast jabs, which can be a bit punishing. But you'll likely notice that right before he starts that move, he raises his eyebrows a few times. That's his tell, and once you know it exists, you'll know exactly what move is about to come. Many of the fighters in the game have similar tells, though as you get deeper into the fights, the window you have to react will get shorter and shorter, until finally you get to the point where you need literal split-second timing to be successful. Anyway, moving on with our fighters. The next opponent I found interesting was King Hippo, who is absolutely devastating if he gets a series of hits in on you. Luckily, he's also one of the easiest fighters to knock out, and if you end up knocking him down, which requires a very specific series of moves, you'll find that he won't be able to get back up again. From what I could tell, King Hippo is the only fighter who can't get back up from a knockdown, which I thought was an interesting design decision. He's not particularly difficult once you figure out his moves, but I did find him to be a memorable encounter. Bald Bull is the next on my list of interesting encounters, and that's for a couple reasons. For one, he has a charge kind of attack that requires specific timing to punish, which is fun to figure out. And two, you get to fight him 2 different times, with the second one adding in some interesting mechanics, including a new form for his rush attack with new timing, and the fact that he can't be knocked down by a normal attack. The only way to knock this second version of Bald Bull down is to either time a punch just right during his rush attack, or to deplete his hit points and follow that up with an uppercut. Now, a quick note about Bald Bull. I have heard some people complain about the timing needed to hit him in the middle of his rush attack, and I'll admit, when I played the game previously, I also had some difficulty. But this last playthrough, I had literally 0 issues timing the attack. I don't know if that's because I've been playing a ton of retro games and am now conditioned so much that my timing has improved over the last year and a half or what, but for some reason, Bald Bull really didn't give me any difficulty during my current playthrough, which is not something I was able to say at any other point in my life. I should also mention that the Bald Bull fight was the subject of some recent internet fame, as it was discovered that the timing of the punch you need to execute is indicated by a camera flash in the crowd behind him. This, I thought, was an absolutely awesome find. Not so much because I needed it to help me defeat him, but simply because of the ingenuity on the part of the development team to hide a pretty big tell in plain sight, and yet have it be undiscovered for years and years. I love that kind of stuff. Now, there are a few more fighters that I want to shine a spotlight on, the next one being Soda Popinski. Soda Popinski only exists in the final most difficult circuit, and from my perspective is the first real gut check that you'll face in the game. Sure, prior fights might cause you some difficulty depending on your overall familiarity with the game, but Soda Popinski is something else, with very quick uppercuts and a hook attack that can occasionally be difficult to time. He was the first real brick wall I faced in my latest playthrough of the game, and it took me a good number of fights with him before I got his timing down and was able to beat him pretty consistently. From my perspective, a very well-designed fight that teaches you some solid lessons for the fights to come. And speaking of fights to come, the final 3 fights of the game all warrant some discussion, because they are effectively a gauntlet of difficulty that far exceeds every other fight that came before them. The first foe in this pugilistic path of pain is Mr. Sandman, who will likely give you fits when you first fight him. The first stage of his fight, with a series of jabs preceded by some fancy fist work, is nothing special and is relatively easy to figure out. But the next section of the fight has some very tricky timing, and if he decides to go for his series of 3 super uppercuts, you might as well grab your pillow, because it's almost certainly lights out. Or at least that's how you'll feel when you first start fighting him. Like most fights in the game, he is entirely learnable and beatable with practice, and even his super uppercut sequence, which at first feels nearly impossible to dodge, is in fact readable and avoidable. Now, I will say that most of the time, I took at least one hit from that sequence before avoiding the next 2, so even with a ton of practice, he is still dangerous, but he is definitely doable. Interestingly, Mr. Sandman is widely considered one of the more difficult fighters in the game, though from my perspective, he is probably placed appropriately in the overall difficulty scale, with him, for me, being the 3rd hardest fight in the entire experience. The second hardest fight is the opponent that immediately precedes Mr. Sandman, and that's Super Macho Man. What makes Super Macho Man tricky is that he effectively combines the power and speed of Soda Popinski with a nearly unavoidable move, like Mr. Sandman's uppercut sequence, which is truly a recipe for disaster. It took me quite some time to figure out Super Macho Man, and even when I completely understood his moveset, there were occasions where a missed dodge led to a nasty knockdown. With that said, he's probably one of my favorite fights in the game, because he is truly challenging, but totally beatable. And if the game ended here, I think I would have been happy, and I believe most people would still consider Super Macho Man a valid end boss for the title. But Super Macho Man is not the real end boss of the game. That distinction goes to Kid Dynamite himself, Iron Mike Tyson. I want to impress something upon you right up front. The Mike Tyson fight is the most difficult, frustrating fight in the game, and it is not even close. While every other fight featured challenging encounters, even the most difficult opponents were eventually beatable, consistently with practice. Mike Tyson is something entirely different. To start, he begins the first 1.5 minutes of the fight throwing a barrage of mostly random, insanely fast one-hit knockdown uppercuts, where literally a single mistake means you land on your butt. The first few times you fight Tyson, I can guarantee you'll think the game is simply trolling you. And I can imagine quite a few people have gotten up to Tyson, tried him a couple times, and simply said, nope, not happening, before shutting down their console and moving on to other games. And in fact, I've even seen some rationalization on various internet forums that suggests that Mike Tyson is simply a bonus fight, and that if you beat Super Macho Man, you really beat the game, so there's no need to defeat Tyson. A lot of people using this argument claim that because one of the early versions of Punch-Out didn't include Tyson to begin with, that he's not a required part of the game. Well, let me tell you, I actually wrestled with this one as I was playing myself, because Tyson is hard. I did question myself several times as to whether I'd actually be able to beat him, and it took me hours before I put up even the semblance of a fight. But eventually, I did get there. I survived the first 1 minute and 30 seconds of the fight. Which is to say, I now had to figure out how to survive the next 7.5 minutes of the fight. Luckily though, the rest of the fight is a good bit easier than the first minute 30, but it is not without its own challenges, complete with tight timing, semi-random patterns, and incredibly damaging punches. Eventually, with enough practice, you can beat Iron Mike, though most likely the only way you're going to do that is by TKO or by going the distance and winning by decision. Up until very recently, I thought that actually knocking out Mike Tyson was impossible, but I have seen some recent internet posts that suggest I was wrong in that assumption. I'm not entirely sure what the conditions were around those victories, but I do want to do a little bit more research. From my perspective though, actually knocking out Mike Tyson is something that very few, if any, people will ever do. The good news is that there is a cheat code available that lets you skip right to the Mike Tyson fight, which means you can practice him as much as you want to learn the fight. For me though, that wasn't enough. I had to beat him without cheats, which meant I could only use the passwords the game provided to me during the normal act of playing the game. That meant that every attempt at Tyson involved beating Super Macho Man first, followed by the Tyson fight. And let me tell you, that took some time and some luck, but eventually I strung together a good enough couple of fights to emerge victorious and beat the game. though my last fight with Tyson was a Rocky-styled nail-biter that literally came down to the final bell. It was very nerve-wracking, but the feeling of elation and achievement I had after seeing the ref declare me the victor was something else. All told, I probably spent 16 hours or so playing the game to become skilled enough to finally beat Tyson, most of which was spent on Tyson himself. That is a lot of training, but ultimately, I think it was worth it. I should also mention that despite the achievement I felt when I beat Tyson, I actually despise the fight itself and feel like the first minute 30 of the fight is almost an exercise in futility. Even when you develop your muscle memory enough to react at a moment's notice, you'll still make mistakes and you'll still get knocked down. From my perspective, that portion of the fight is probably too punishing, and while I understand Tyson was an absolute beast in real life around this time, I feel like the game could have been toned down a bit. I should also mention that there's been a lot of talk on the internet about the fact that playing on an emulator and on a modern television adds a certain degree of lag that makes the game decidedly more difficult than playing on an old school CRT. To that, I would say, maybe? I played on devices with a relatively low response time, so I suppose that might have helped. But I didn't have a CRT handy when I was playing the game to really put this to the test. Would the game have been even easier on original hardware on a CRT television? Well, maybe, but I will say that the game is beatable on modern devices, regardless of the inherently higher lag that today's televisions and screens have in comparison to classic CRTs. And by the way, there are some fighters that I completely glossed over, mostly because I found them kinda ho-hum in comparison to the ones I did choose to focus on. I'm sure others might have different opinions, but for me, the ones I called out were the standouts, or at least the ones that felt like they warranted additional discussion. We're going to talk more about the other aspects of the game, like the graphics and the sound, in just a minute, but first, as we always do, we have to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially around this era of gaming, because we didn't have the internet. We didn't have YouTube to look up gameplay videos. A lot of times when we made a buying decision, it was made in the store as we looked at the box. Did the front of the box look cool? Okay, let's pick it up and look at the back of the box. Did the back of the box make the game sound awesome? If so, that was an immediate purchase. So, for Mike Tyson's Punch-Out for the NES, the back of the box says, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out. Meet the ultimate challenge. Fight Mike Tyson. It's a right jab, a left hook, an uppercut. It's Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, where you'll get the chance to compete against boxers from around the globe. Punch your way through 13 bouts in minor, major, and world circuits against tough contenders like Piston Honda, Glass Joe, Super Macho Man, and many, many more. Defeat all your opponents and meet the ultimate challenge against the world heavyweight champion, Mike Tyson, in the greatest fight of all, the Dream Bout. Knock out Tyson and you can become WVBA, World Video Boxing Association, champ. And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, one of which shows you training, the other shows Bald Bull, and a couple of other shots as well. And I have got to say, this box 100% sells me on the game. This is one of those games that I did own when I was a kid. I played it a ton. I love the box for this game. And because when I was growing up, I remember how brutal Mike Tyson was in the ring and how feared he was in the ring. The fact that he was in a video game and that I could potentially fight against him, that was something that intrigued me so much, and I absolutely wanted to give it my all. Now, back then, I never actually did beat the game. I think I got up to Mike Tyson a few times, and he soundly thrashed me. I needed to rectify that for this most recent playthrough, and of course, like I mentioned, I did in fact do that. This box is one of those boxes that is truly a classic because it combines everything that you need in order to sell a title to a prospective consumer, and I absolutely loved it. Let's move on to start talking about the more specific aspects of the game, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Punch-Out are surprisingly good, with large, detailed sprite work for every single boxer you face, which makes the game feel somewhat more like an arcade experience as opposed to the traditional NES-styled sports games. I appreciated the details in each fighter's design, which served to make pretty much every fighter feel distinct, though there were some body types that were partially reused, albeit with a different skin masking that fact. I don't hold this against the game at all, as even though some of the fighters' bodies looked similar, the other design elements were all distinct enough that each fighter felt unique. I also enjoyed the in-between round graphics, where a talking head version of both you and your opponent appears on the screen, with each headshot showing progressive damage depending on how much you've been hit and how much you've hit your opponent. There's really only 2 or 3 stages of damage for each fighter, so it's not like there's a ton of variety here, but I still enjoyed the fact it existed. And each fighter has different distinguishing features depicting their own damage, which means each fight still gives you a different presentation, which serves to keep things fresh. Where the game really shines, though, is in the animations for each fighter, which are all unique, for the most part, and really make you feel like you're fighting a bunch of different fighters as opposed to reskinned versions of other fighters. Across the various fighters you face in the game, there's little, if any, reuse in the animation department, and most fighters have some form of unique move or moveset that is specific to that fighter, which means custom animations. I have to commend the art team on the number of distinct, detailed animations that they included in the game. There's a level of variety here that you do not typically see in NES games, and that variety served directly to increase the feeling that every time you stepped in the ring, you were facing someone new. Otherwise, the rest of the graphics are pretty much your traditional NES-styled 8-bit graphics, all of which look just fine. I really have no complaints about the visual elements of the game. Everything looked pretty darn good. Moving on to the sound and music, while there aren't a ton of different songs in the game, what's here is pretty much perfect, with my personal favorite being the song that plays while you're training in between title circuits. I should mention, though, that while there aren't a ton of songs, I thought the way that the in-ring music was able to transition between standard background fare to something entirely different when either you or your opponent were knocked down was simply awesome, and reminded me of the dynamic soundtracks that some computer games utilized beginning in the early 90s. I'm sure the way Punch-Out combined songs wasn't quite as advanced as a fully dedicated music system like LucasArts' iMuse engine, but it still felt perfectly timed to the action on the screen, which I loved. Sound effects are similarly punchy, with every punch, miss, and uppercut represented with a unique sound effect that, despite the limited NES sound chip, still felt impactful. I honestly have no complaints about the auditory environment in the game. Everything sounded great and meshed perfectly with the action on the screen. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Little Mac, an amateur boxer with dreams of beating opponents and winning championships. Over the course of the game, you'll make your way through 3 different boxing circuits, hopefully winning some title belts along the way. Assuming you're successful, you'll earn the opportunity to face an absolute beast of a fighter, Iron Mike Tyson himself, in a true dream fight. Beating Tyson will take every ounce of skill and fortitude you can muster. Beat him, and you go down in history as one of the greatest fighters of all time. Lose, and you become yet another footnote in boxing history. So as you might have guessed, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is a sports game, and there isn't really any story here to speak of. Even the limited storyline I outlined above is mostly headcanon, but honestly, that's entirely okay, as a sports and gameplay-centric title doesn't really need a story at all. Games like Punch-Out let you write your own narrative depending on your gameplay experiences, and for someone with a vivid imagination, your own narrative is likely better than whatever paper-thin story a typical sports title provides. For this one, it's a case of no story, no problem. The gameplay speaks for itself. And speaking of playability, we've already talked a lot about the controls and the general structure and gameplay of the title already, so we're not going to rehash all of that here. To put it simply, the game's controls are simple, but hide a surprising amount of depth, and the gameplay loop is straightforward, but is itself more complex than it appears at first glance. What I do want to talk about, though, is something I feel is a true accomplishment, and serves to set Punch-Out apart from many other games in both its peer group, as well as games released years later. That accomplishment is the sheer responsiveness of the controls, which borders on instantaneous mind meld kind of reaction time. Now that might sound strange, so let me explain. You know how in most games with a really solid control scheme, you feel totally in control of your character, so much so that he or she becomes an extension of yourself? Well, even in games with ridiculously strong controls, there is usually something about them that serves to demonstrate that you are in fact playing a game, and the game is translating your inputs into action on the screen. That might be the slightest bit of infinitesimal lag, or it might be a sense of just slightly too long lasting momentum, or it might be the feeling that you just pressed a button but nothing happened. Whatever the case, even in games with phenomenally good and responsive controls, you still know you're playing a game, and you still know that your inputs need to go through some sort of translation in order for your character to move the way you want to move them. With Punch-Out!, it feels like your inputs are translated immediately to the action on the screen, meaning that the responsiveness of the controls and the timing of your reactionary inputs are about as close to one-to-one as I've ever seen. There is literally no lag here at all, and I was in plenty of fights where I was about to get hit with a devastating punch, and I was able to dodge left or right with the action on the screen moving 100% at the same time I pressed the controller, leading to numerous close calls and dodges that I honestly was expecting to fail. Nowhere is this more evident than during the fight with Mike Tyson, where you need to be completely focused in order to dodge his attacks, and trying to anticipate a move rather than reacting to his split-second tells will result in a knockdown. This fight, while devilishly difficult, never felt truly unfair because the controls were so tight that you could technically dodge everything he throws at you, assuming your own muscle memory and reaction time is fast enough. In lesser games, this fight would have been impossible. In Punch-Out!, it's an incredibly challenging situation, but something you can actually train for and overcome. I can't impress upon you how responsive the controls are. It's something that has to be felt to be truly understood. Beyond that, we have already talked about most of the important aspects of the game already. Bottom line, the game controls like a dream and remains infinitely playable and replayable even today. So overall, how did it feel to play Punch-Out!? Well, it simply felt awesome to play, and any moments of frustration driven by the late game's increased difficulty were immediately resolved by recognizing that the game itself is never truly unfair. It's simply you and me as players that need to get better before we can respond to the game's challenge. I can honestly say that there are very few games where I can look back on them and say, that's an entirely skill-based fair experience, but for Punch-Out!, I truly feel that's the situation. Other than the first minute 30 of the Tyson fight, which is probably tuned just a bit too difficult, the rest of the game is a nearly perfect arcade fighting experience, and I absolutely loved it. So, what is our verdict on Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!? This one doesn't even need to go to the judges' scorecards, because for me, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Scored a proverbial knockout, and is therefore a surefire entry into our pantheon of classic gaming. There's not much to dislike here. Nearly every aspect of the game is a masterclass in game, mechanics, and control design, and it's not hyperbole to suggest that Punch-Out! Is one of the best games on the NES, and undoubtedly one of the best games of all time, regardless of console. This is an old-school, challenging, but rewarding experience, and it deserves your attention. If you haven't already played Punch-Out!, definitely seek it out. I can almost guarantee you'll have some fun, and while I do believe the late game difficulty will be a turnoff for some, the rest of the game is a simply joyous experience, which is why for me, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Deserves its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have a Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do gaming challenges. We have great discussions. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It's patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on the RPG Earthbound, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. I'd also like to remind everybody that in a few episodes, we'll be having our listener grab bag episode for our next Sounds of the Classics. So if you are interested in participating in that, send in your game and song selections along with why those songs mean something to you, and you could be featured on the show. At the same time, I recognize that you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about bolstering star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings. So if that happens, awesome. It means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to gather the feedback necessary to make this the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to gather feedback from you, the listener community, to make sure that I am delivering the content you want to listen to and covering the kinds of games that you want to learn about. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply awesome. I want to continue to make sure that I am delivering the best content possible, and I want to make sure that I continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Earthbound. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.